Alright, g'day IB Psychology students. Here are the 5 biggest mistakes students make when they submit their introduction to their IA. Alright, so let's have a look at what the top 5 mistakes are that students make in their introductions. Remember, you don't want to be doing these things. Number 5, the independent variable and the dependent variable are not operationalized in the hypotheses. Now, you only have to operationalize it in one of them. I suggest the alternative or your research hypothesis. Alright, now one tip you could do is operationalize your IV and your DV separately. So don't try to do it in your hypotheses to begin with. Separate it out first and try and do it that way, and then try your best to include the operational definition in your research hypothesis. Now, just a reminder, an operational definition is how are you defining that variable in your particular study. So specifically, how are you going to manipulate your independent variable? Be very specific. And specifically, how are you going to measure your dependent variable? So for example, in my IA that I wrote as an example, okay, my independent variable was the type of media, presenting the thin ideal or a neutral, and the dependent variable was body satisfaction. So how did I measure body satisfaction in my experiment? I used the body shape questionnaire. How did I manipulate the type of media? Well, they watched different film trailers, and these are specified here. One thing you can do is use these brackets to do the specific condition like this. Now, again, this is an example IA that I wrote that would be unethical and impractical, and do not try to do this particular study in your IA. I did one that you can't replicate to avoid students copying this example. This is in the IA Teacher Support Pack, which you can find the link to in the description. So you can see here I've operationalized my IV and DV in my research hypothesis, not in my null hypothesis. I think that's the best way to do it. Okay, number 4, the 4th biggest mistake students make is they don't explain the relevance of their aim. Now, this is something that you have to do. So I would use the word relevant somewhere in your explanation. So when you're explaining your aim, you say this is relevant because, right? And the reasons and why it can be relevant could be included, how the results can be applied. How can we use these results? So that's really what you're trying to explain here. Again, taken from my example, this is the aim of my study, how watching the media can influence body dissatisfaction. And then here I've got a separate paragraph where I give the explanation. Now, I've put important topic. I could have said this is a relevant topic because, so that would have probably been better. And I'm saying, if we understand the origins of eating disorders, then maybe we can find better treatments. Now, you can see why this would be an unethical study to actually do for your IA, because it's about eating disorders, and so we don't really want to do that kind of thing, which is exactly why I chose it as an example. So, explain the relevance of your aim in your introduction. So coming in number 3, the aim itself is quite poorly written, and oftentimes, so I'm an IA moderator, and so I read a lot of IAs and mark them and check the marking. To write a clear aim, you must include the independent variable and dependent variable in the aim, because the aim of any experiment is to see how does the independent variable affect the dependent variable, right? So this is my aim here, right? To see if watching video clips, that's my portraying the thin ideal, would have an effect on body dissatisfaction. So my independent variable here is the video clips, right? And to see if that factor, watching that the thin ideal, would have an effect on, and here's my dependent variable, right? Body dissatisfaction. So the aim of any experiment is to understand an effect, right? A cause and effect. So include what's the cause, what's the effect. That is how you should include it in your aim. So make sure it's one sentence, but it's really important that you get that right. All right, number 2, the link between your investigation and the theory or model is not explained. Now, I would even suggest to use the word link and even investigation in your explanation. So highlight really that you're hitting all the requirements for the introduction. Now, in order to explain the link, what does that really mean? Well, one way to do this would be to explain what claim of the theory or model are you testing and how will you test it. So any theory or model is trying to explain some element of human behavior or cognition, right? And so what you want to try and do is explain, right? How are you going to test that claim? Okay, and so for example, in mine, I'm looking at the social comparison theory. That's the background model that I was using, and I've used here I've used a social comparison theory to explain the results of the original study that I'm replicating, and then I get into a second paragraph and explain with my particular study, right, what I'm doing, and then how that link can be investigated. And I think, here, we wanted to investigate the link between media and body dissatisfaction, right? So here, again, I'm using the terminology that is included in the rubric. So to make it really clear that I'm hitting those requirements. And that's what I recommend you do as well. So make sure you try to explain the link between your investigation, right? Which really means the study that you're conducting, and the background theory or model. right? Okay, now the number one mistake students make in their introduction is they do not describe the background theory or model, or at least they might mention it, but they don't fully describe it. So how do you fully describe the background theory or model? Here's a few tips that I would recommend. One, you can save words if your word count is an issue in the IA, which it is for a lot of students. Very briefly describe the original study that you're copying. Actually, you'll see in a second when I show you the rubric. There's no mention in the rubric of actually having to base your research on an original study. And so your summary of it can be very, very brief. Don't go into heaps of detail about the original study that you're basing yours off of. Okay, just mention it briefly. Just brief summary of the methods, one sentence or two sentences of well, how do they manipulate the IV, how do they measure the DV, and the results, conclusions. That's it. So I would suggest that the summary of your background theory or model should be as detailed as the summary of the study that you include in your introduction. Now, do you even need to put the original study in your introduction? Do you even need to base your IA on original study? No, but I still recommend that you do, because that's what we're expecting and that's the easiest way to go about it. It's what 99% of students do. So I would still recommend including the details of the original study and definitely using an original study to base your experiment off of, but you don't need to spend a lot of time explaining it in the introduction. Now, finally, how do you describe the background theory or model? Well, try to use that theory to explain the phenomenon that you are investigating. So, for example, in my case, I'm looking at eating disorders and the rise of eating disorders. This is a phenomenon that I'm trying to explain, and I'm looking at, more specifically, the effect of media. The explanation of this phenomenon is that media is increasing the rise of eating disorders. So I'm using social comparison theory to try to explain how and why the media can influence eating disorders. And this is my full description down here. Okay, so you can see this is how I would begin my introduction. I have a very general introduction about the topic that I'm studying. I can even mention a few studies that have investigated the link, and I'm going to talk about one of these later on in my essay. And then here I fully explain how that theory explains the phenomenon that I'm investigating. So that would be how I would suggest you have a detailed background theory and model. And you see, this summary here is about as detailed as the original study. So again, you can get this whole example in the IA Teacher Support Pack. So that are the 5 biggest mistakes that students make. So let's have a look at the rubric. It's all, they're mistakes that students make because they're not hitting the rubric. So you have to state your aim really clearly and explain its relevance, right? That's the first thing. You have to have the theory or model that your investigation is based on and describe it, and make sure the link to the investigation is explained. Okay, in other words, so you can say how is or what claims of that theory or model are you testing in your study. Okay, and again, use this terminology from the rubric. The IV and DV have to be stated. Okay, and so that's where you can state it separately, right? This is my IV, this is my DV, and then operationalize it in the null or the research hypothesis. I recommend trying to operationalize it in the research hypothesis. Again, that can be very wordy, it can be very difficult, so if you're having a hard time doing that, actually, no, I've definitely, because it states here in the rubric, so stick to the rubric, operationalize it in the research hypothesis. And again, putting these specific ways that you manipulated or measured the IV and DV in the brackets can be a really good way to do that. All right, so if you want to score top marks, get a 6 out of 6 for your introduction, for your IA, make sure you do these things, right, and you don't make those mistakes. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Here's a checklist that you might want to use. You can pause this video as you're writing. Again, the checklist, a whole checklist is included in the IA Teacher Support Pack. So, and in fact, this is even in order of what I would recommend that you put it in the introduction. So, general introduction, describe the theory and model, describe the original study, state the aim of yours, explain your relevance, make sure the link is clearly explained, the hypotheses, then the IV and DV, boom, 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 boom. 6 out of 6 for introduction. Well done. Okay, so, right, subscribe, blog, information, everything's in the description. There's a teacher support pack. Hope that was helpful. Good luck.